So maybe if I could shift gears, I've often thought that there's very interesting aspect of the financial services industry, which is that I think it's got some advantages in being forward thinking in data by virtue of being purely transactional, right? So when there's physical stuff involved, there are some added complexities to that. Also, there's money in financial services, which and I think that it technology and data perhaps has been viewed for a long time more strategically in some of those industries than in, like OEM manufacturing industrial companies. Just kind of an interesting observation. But that said, there's sort of a flip side of that. So there's some special challenges that you face in terms of regulatory, data privacy, data ethics, very much top of mind, I think, on the even the national agenda is how do we think about this whole space of data privacy and data ethics, model bias. My sense is that there's been more forward thinking in financial services around that. I'm very interested in what your perspective on that is. And maybe if you can touch within that, like what's the relationship with regulators? Like is industry leading and regulators trying to catch up? Is it, one hand washes the other, some combination?
No, it did. And I'll start by just saying, I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's a push and pull on both in terms of industry leading or regulatory catching up. I think in some instances, regulatory is now realizing the power of data. And so they will, catch up to initiatives that we've been pushing for a while when it comes to AI or machine learning. On the flip side, there's also been some really, impressive, well thought out and well structured regulatory movements that continue to evolve that we are catching up to. It's going to sound odd when I say this, but I actually get very excited by that because I think we have the ability to start to your point, continue to lead in the space. If you think about, the ethical use of data, you can digest that 9 million different ways. And what I love about our approach within Nationwide is we view that as what's our framework? What's our framework that aligns to our values? And we stick to that. And so as questions come up, as things need to get escalated to leadership, we stick to a framework that aligns to our values. And there's no gray there. If you think about diversity and bias and all of those things, data actually gives you the ability to start to move away from that. Traditionally, models all have those innate bias in it. We have the ability with data to move away from that. We can now look at sources that are viewed on behaviors, activities, characteristics of people that have nothing to do with prior just a medical history we now have the ability to use data to get away from bias. And so when you think about the power of my role within an insurance company, I view it as I now can get away from any of that we can move the business forward from just looking at people from a behavioral standpoint. So I think it's an incredibly empowering opportunity within our industry, and we have one to lead. But again, it comes down to that framework aligned to your values, but also how do we start to use data in unique ways to move away from any bias?
So kind of tying this to the educational question, right? It's like you and I can have a conversation, and I'm pretty confident that when I talk about like data set bias and model bias, like we understand what that means, but lots of people don't understand what it means.
Yep.
So when you get into, working with regulators or, folks who are less steeped in data, what's your thought on kind of educating? Like, I'm just curious how you do it. Like, I have some stories that I tell around, this kind of data creates this kind of outcome, and you sort of you get out of it what you put into it. So think of that. But I'm curious, like, this is sort of a new thought societally in a way over the last couple of years in particular.
I always do that. Before you climb the hill, you have to get off your small mountain, go into the valley, and then start to climb your big hill. I think we're now to the point where we're climbing the big hill. I think there's a huge opportunity, I think, and how we view it. It's you have so lost in the data that we lose sight of the person behind the data. So as part of our guiding principle is we have to focus on the person behind the data. So regardless of model, regardless of all the things that we could probably get into from a dialogue perspective, the biggest person behind the data, behind the model, you find that you're pretty aligned with the regulators. And so there's a good partnership that you can strike there. But again, it's the balance between the magic and the blindness you can create with your data, but also focusing on the individual behind it. And I find that's where I've had really powerful and positive conversations with the regulators.
So maybe if I could, I want to play this back, and because I think you made a key point. So it's kind of become a truism that, especially in socials, right? That if there's no product, then you're the product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your point is, let's get away from that and not think of the person and the person's data as a product, but think of the person and how we're driving outcomes for the person, for society, and for the business. And if we do that from kind of a value framework standpoint, then we're going to minimize the risk that we get into trouble by getting sort of caught up in our own algorithms and not really looking at not really looking at it from a human standpoint. Is that a fair sort of reflection?
Much better stated, and yes, that's exactly it.
Okay, you get all the credit for that, but thank you.